For anybody who hasn't joined us for one of these talks before, my name is Ailish Ryan. I'm a representative for the Workers' Party in Ireland and a member of the Ard Comhairle of the party. And we've been running online discussions since the start of the lockdown, just as part of our normal party educational work. And we are delighted tonight to be joined by Ajamu Baraka. So Ajamu Baraka is somebody who a number of people here will remember from a recent anti-war summit, International Peace Summit held in Liberty Hall in Dublin, which is where the Workers' Party would have come across him. He's a prominent anti-war activist, as well as being the National Organiser with Black Alliance for Peace. And he also previously ran for the US vice presidency as running mate with Jill Stein. Obviously the Green Party, that was with the Green Party. The Green Party in Ireland is currently about to go into government with two right-wing organisations, but in the United States have been fairly consistently anti-war and anti-imperialist. And I think it was probably in that capacity that Ajamu was involved with them. So we're delighted to have him speaking about what's happening in the United States at the moment and has been happening over the last couple of months. And as far as I know, Ajamu was going to give a little bit of the history to the protest, the background to them, and something about what we can expect to come from them. So I'll hand over to you, Ajamu, for maybe 30 minutes or so, and we'll then have questions and discussion for 20 minutes or so.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me for this hopefully informative conversation. Let me begin by, I made a pledge yesterday that in all of my public presentations, I will acknowledge the existence of political prisoners in the US. We just had Delbert Africa, who had been incarcerated for 42 years up until January, and was released, and he passed the day before yesterday. And we believe it's important that people in the US, but even more importantly, outside of the US, be made aware of the fact that we still have in the US the longest serving political prisoners on the planet. People who are approaching their fifth decade in prison. So we start our public conversations with that bit of information, acknowledging the existence of those men and women up until recently who have been in the dungeons of the US for decades. Well, thank you so much. I want to first say, just in case, I spent 35 years in the southern part of the United States of America. So if you are unable to understand my southern accent, please let me know. You can stop me and I will try to speak a little bit slower. Let me say a little bit first about the Black Alliance for Peace, and then we'll talk a little bit about the context of the protests, and then we'll get right into the meat of the conversation. It's important for people to know that the Black Alliance for Peace was just born a few years ago. Now, the motivation for launching the alliance was based on the fact that on April the 4th, 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King reconnected with the radical Black tradition by adding his voice of opposition to the murderous US war machine unleashed on the people of Vietnam. For Dr. King, his silence on the war in Vietnam had become an irreconcilable moral contradiction. He declared that it was hypocritical for him to proclaim the superiority, the superior value of nonviolence as a life principle, while the US remained the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet. he thought that it was a contradiction for him to remain silent as the US government engaged in genocidal violence against the people of Vietnam. We say Dr. King reconciled or reconnected with the Black radical tradition because Dr. King was in fact late. In 1967, when he embraced an oppositional position on Vietnam, it was years after other formations, including the Revolutionary Action Movement, Malcolm X, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panthers had taken resolute stance against the war in Vietnam. This is part of the Black liberation process. The Black liberation movement that those organizations represented, worker-based, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and international, that is. On April the 4th, 2017, 50 years after that very famous speech in which he broke with the US government, we launched the Black Alliance for Peace. We saw that after more than 3 decades of pro-war conditioning by both corporate parties and the corporate media, coupled with cultural desensitization from almost 2 decades of unrelenting war, opposition to militarism and war was something that had almost disappeared in the US among the general population. The Black public was not immune to those cultural and political changes. And with the ascendancy of the corporatist president, Barack Obama, who during his tenure, the US continued its militaristic bent unabated, and in fact, it was ratcheted up. That lack of awareness and that lack of opposition to US militarism deepened even more. So what we saw was that it was an absolute necessity for us to relaunch a formation to attempt to try to recapture the traditional anti-war and anti-imperialist positions of the Black radical tradition. As many of you might know, the Black community, Black people, the Black working class have been consistently, up until recently, the most anti-war and anti-imperialist community probably in the US. And so the Black Alliance for Peace was launched to try to recapture, revive that spirit of opposition. But we have to make sure that people understand that the Black Alliance for Peace is a fighting organization. We are clear. We say no justice, no peace. The Alliance is what we call a people-centered human rights project against war, repression, and imperialism. That again seeks to recapture and redevelop the anti-war, anti-imperialist spirit. Well, we see this and see our work as part of a broader effort to not only revive our anti-war traditions, but to help to revive the broader anti-war, pro-peace, anti-imperialist movement in the United States of America. For the Black Alliance for Peace, though, we make the connections between the domestic state violence and repression and the global war-mongering machine. We see, for example, the pivot to Asia, NATO and the rotating of NATO troops on the borders of Russia, the expansion of the US Africa Command, continued support for apartheid Israel, police executions and impunity in the US, the carceral state with the mass incarceration of Black and other colonized workers and poor people as elements and policies of one oppressive global system of colonial capitalist white supremacist power. So the context of struggle in the U.S. must be understood, must begin with a structural analysis, and that's where we want to turn now. The context. Well, we see that the ongoing and current capitalist crisis has created the most serious crisis of legitimacy since the collapse of the capitalist economy during the years referred to as the Great Depression. The economic collapse comes on the heels of the deep crisis of the economy that occurred in 2007, 2008. With the economic instability and the increasing economic competition among capitalist states, divisions have emerged among the nations that those of us in the Black Alliance for Peace refer to as the US, EU, NATO axis of domination. The US has responded by moving toward a more confrontational posture, not only with its allies in Europe, but it has also elevated China and Russia as national security threats. Domestically, the Black working class never recovered from the collapse of 2007, 2008. The continued restructuring of the US economy to a low-wage economy has resulted in the Black working class being relegated to the lower rungs of the labor force, joining undocumented migrants, immigrants, and other colonized workers. We are now seeing with the economy the genocidal implications of economic conditions in which young Black workers have more value as human generators of profit locked up in prisons than as participants in the economy as low-wage workers. This reality is one of the factors driving the obscene phenomenon of Black and brown mass incarceration in the largest prison system on the planet. Astronomical youth unemployment, millions of African or Black people without health care, poison environments and crumbling schools reflect the objective conditions that with COVID-19 are ravaging the Black communities. This, we say, is the reality of the colonial capitalist system in its neoliberal stage. And this is before the coronavirus pandemic. The coronavirus pandemic pulled the ideological curtain away from the system and exposed the brutal realities of a rapacious system of greed, human exploitation and degradation, social insecurity, corruption, and the normalization of coercive state violence. Bipartisan support for neoliberal capitalist policies over the last 4 decades revealed the devastating impacts of neoliberal policies. The closing of public health care facilities, including hospitals as giant for-profit hospital chains consolidated. Millions, disproportionately Black people, living precarious lives at the bottom of the labor market and as gig workers with no benefits, no sick leave, no vacation, no security when ordered to shutter in place as a consequence of COVID-19. Hundreds of Black people are dying unnecessarily from the virus because of conditions of colonial oppression that we referred to just a moment ago, which we say amounts to a situation of state-sanctioned murder. So the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, who was murdered by police in her bed, Ahmaud Arbery, and a Black person in Brunswick, Georgia, murdered by non-state actors, white vigilantes. Um, and the whole phenomenon of the of vicious killer cops is just the tip of the iceberg. So this is the context we say that we have to bring to our understanding of what is happening in the U.S., connecting up the pandemic and the ongoing structural contradictions of capitalism, the impact of the collapse from that pandemic on not only Black people, Black workers, but on everyone, in particular the working class in the United States of America. And we provide that context, my friends, because we say that in some ways, George Floyd and the resistance is almost a metaphor for what is unfolding in the US. And what do I mean by that? As a consequence of this pandemic, as a consequence of the disproportionate impact of this pandemic on the Black working class, as a consequence of the clear message to workers of all racial and ethnic backgrounds that their lives mean very little when it comes to the objective interests of capital. There's been a process of radicalization among the people, in particular among the working class. The clear message from the rulers is that the humanity, the safety, the health of workers mean almost nothing in comparison to the needs of capital. Therefore, the knee on the neck of George Floyd that we saw became almost a metaphor for what millions of people are experiencing. They're experiencing the knee on their neck from capital. So while the cry was for something called justice for George Floyd and so-called police reform, what we see, what some of us see is a unarticulated, at this point, rebellion against the dehumanization and degradation of late-stage capitalism known as neoliberalism that is responsible for bringing people to the streets. There's no other way that one can understand the breadth and intensity of the mobilizations. LGBTQ, the unemployed youth from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, downsized petty bourgeois elements, suburbanites, all the sectors of the population have shown up in the streets in hundreds of cities and towns across the country. So what has been the response from the state? Well, I think many of us have seen a sort of an evolution take place. First, there was clear repression. The heavy-handed response from the authorities, from the militarized police, and the calling up of what we refer to as the state police, the police that go beyond the city, and the National Guard. Every state, as many of you know, but in case you don't know, every state in the US has a National Guard. These are civilians who also serve in the military. They do military maneuvers. They serve as active duty soldiers from time to time. We might recall, or we should just remind people that during the period that the US was involved in a two-theater war, that is war in both Iraq and Afghanistan, it was the National Guard that played a very important role in those wars, as in fact, one of the foundational armed elements to be able to carry out the strategy of two wars simultaneously. So we're talking about military personnel when we talk about the National Guard. They were called up into various cities and states across the country. So repression was the first response. Then there was an attempt to begin to co-opt. Some of you may have seen some of the images of the police kneeling with the protesters, sometimes even joining into the marches. But we also saw, and that wasn't it wasn't disseminated as widely. We saw police forces using the kneeling gesture as a way to lure protesters closer to them, and then they would attack. Those images also were circulated, but not so much in the international press. Then we saw, after the attempt or the continued attempt to try to co-opt the resistance, then we saw a very clever move on the part of the state that began to criminalize the resistors. They began to raise the issue of the violence of some of the protesters and calling on the protesters to begin to police themselves to make sure that the resistance would remain what they define as non-violence. And part of that criminalization process was they began to then engage in a process of racial division. And they use a very interesting sort of device. They began to talk about the so-called outside agitator. But in this case, it was a white outside agitator. They said it was the white outside agitators who were responsible for the looting and the escalation of violence. And then you might recall that President Trump then identified the Antifa, the anti-fascist, this amorphous group of individuals, some people who were part of organizations, who emerged after the election of Donald Trump, proclaiming that they were going to, in fact, oppose what they saw as a neo-fascist movement developing in the country. Donald Trump said that this amorphous element were, in fact, domestic terrorists, and that they were the ones that were responsible for the violence taking place across the country. So what we started seeing was suspicion on the part of some of the march organizers when it came to the participation of some white comrades. Then there was, it was and is, an attempt to colonize the resistance by the Democrats. Some kind of way in the process of these 2 weeks, it began to move away from a call for so-called justice and policing and police reform, which is a local issue. Remember, we have almost 19,000 police forces in the US. Policing is a local responsibility. Some kind of way, though, the whole opposition and the whole movement ended up being about Trump, some kind of way. There was an anti-Trump movement. And of course, Trump played right into it when he ordered the protesters outside of the White House to be pushed back so that he could engage in a photo op at a church. And of course, his bombastic rhetoric played right into it, so that after 7 days of resistance, it began to look like the resistors were basically anti-Trump, and people started talking about the necessity of voting Trump out of office and beginning to articulate Democrat Party talking points. All of this, my friends, have been attempts to try to control this opposition. I keep referring to so-called racial justice, and not to belittle the notion of racial justice, but to suggest that it was in the interest of the state to try to keep this resistance as a issue of so-called racial justice for an individual, George Floyd, and for it to be seen as something moving toward police reform. They were scared to death at the images that we all saw of young Black and white and brown people engaged in resistance. It is a nightmare scenario on the part of the rulers, that there will be a multinational, multiracial opposition under the leadership of radical Black people emerging in the United States. So they were desperate to keep the focus away from a pivot toward a critique of the system and the nature of the state and the nature of the system, and to break up the emerging coalitions of progressive and radical elements among the people in this country. So what would happen next? Well, we believe that there's going to be a continuation of the attempts to try to control the narrative, to keep it from pivoting in a way that we saw, for example, with the so-called yellow vests in France. We all recall that what brought them to the streets at first was a reaction to attempts to try to change the pension. It was about pension reform, but it gradually began to morph into a general anti-neoliberal opposition. The state in the US is very much concerned about that same kind of trajectory. But we argue that that has to happen if this is going to be sustainable. So there's going to be an attempt by the state, a continued attempt to try to prevent that from happening, to depoliticize the opposition in a way. They are completely attempting to try to make sure that there's no real class analysis. They don't want us to point this back to the ongoing plight of the working class, in particular the Black and brown working class that is disproportionately negatively impacted by the corona pandemic. The fact that it is workers, Black and brown workers primarily, who they identified as the so-called essential workers, who are contracting the virus, who are dying from the virus. They don't want us to make a connection with that and to raise again the fact that you have a healthcare system in the US in which now 80 million people are without healthcare. They don't want us to make those connections that the very fact that they were concerned about the healthcare system being overwhelmed is because you have a for-profit healthcare industrial system in the US. And that the only way that an effective response to the pandemic would in fact be a healthcare system nationalized and in the hands of the people, where you have national coordination and you have healthcare delivery that would be coordinated and would be something that could be sustainable beyond the pandemic. They want to keep keep the focus on the issue of race. But what we say is that we have to make sure that that pivot takes place, that there is in fact a focus on class and race issues. We need to connect the issues of what is unfolding in the US to US imperialism and to militarism. We say that as people are making the cry to defund the police, that if you don't connect the defund slogan to defund the military, then that in fact becomes almost a reactionary slogan that drives the movement into the dead end of policy wonkism, if you will. we say this is a moral contradiction to advocate for a more kinder, gentler police force domestically, while the U.S. is unleashing systematic violence against people around the world. So my friends, we say that this is the context, this is what we think is unfolding with the George Floyd protests. This is what we think might be the way in which things will unfold politically in the US. And it is a situation in the US that is very, very interesting because it's generating not only international solidarity, but it is resulting in a situation in which the US state will never be able to, with a straight face, talk about human rights in other countries. It will prevent the US from pretending to be a state that is upholding international law. It is revealing to people around the world the true nature of the system in the US and the plight of the working class, and in particular, the Black and brown colonized working classes in the United States of America. So these protests in the midst of this fundamental collapse of the global capitalist economy is playing and is creating a situation in which is no telling what may unfold over the next few weeks and few months. Is creating a situation that is very, very interesting and historic in its implications. So I will end here and take any questions, comments, or whatever that you may have. So thank you.
Great to hear that applause, wherever it's coming from. Thanks very much, everybody, for that. And thanks very much, Ajamu. That was really enlightening. And I think it contrasts to a lot of the media coverage of the recent events that people will have seen as well. So I suppose if there's anybody there that does want to come in, either put up your hand, put a question in the chat box there, or alternatively, feel free to just unmute yourself and come in. And Ajamu, we might just take 2 or 3 questions together, if that's okay.
Okay.
Audra, would you like to come in?
Hi there. Hi. Yes. Thank you for doing this. This is incredible. I absolutely, in every way, shape, and form, appreciate that you've done this. And thank you for taking my question. My question is, or my comment first is, when I think about how we replace neoliberal capitalism, my brain breaks. And I'm wondering if you have systems that you've thought about that would replace neoliberal capitalism. As we have it today, it's not sustainable, and I'd be preaching to the choir to explain all of those reasons. I know you all know them already. I think that's it. Thank you.
Anybody else want to come in there? I might just throw in a question. I suppose it's somewhat related, but do keep coming in there, other people, while I'm speaking. I guess I'd be interested to know, sometimes it seems hard to see how all of this can lead to a progressive outcome because of a lot of the times the lack of kind of organized political alternatives capable of kind of harnessing all the energy and all the anger. And so, Ajamu, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Like, how can you see what would need to happen to make this, turn this into a progressive, sustainable change? Anybody else want to come in there before we go back? Sure, maybe you just start answering those, and people do put up your hands there or put. Okay, Gavin, sorry, there's a lot of distortion there on your line, so maybe stick in.
Sorry, Michael Clark just had his hand up there.
Oh yeah, Michael Clark, sorry, go ahead.
Thanks, Ailish. I just wanted to say hello to Ajamu, first of all. Nice to see you again. And to say thank you for this. I just wanted to make two very brief comments. One was about the conference that you mentioned at the beginning, Ailish. I just wanted to say that after the conference, Hannah and the US Peace Council put a book together of the proceedings. If anybody wants it, I'll give you my email address at the end, and if anybody they can contact me, I'll get them a copy. It's well worth a read. I just wanted to mention that. The other is that Ajamu's presentation was tremendously interesting. We're not hearing in the media, we're not getting in the media the wider economic and colonial dimension to the way that the US is breaking down. We're just not hearing that. So anything that helps to get across this wider and deeper dimension is very, very welcome. Thank you.
Great. So maybe do you want to answer those three questions, Ajamu? And people do come in there while Ajamu is talking. Put up your hands.
Yes. Thank you so much, and it's so good to see you again, Michael. I can't wait to get back there, get some of your delicious breakfasts, and and spend some time with you. Let me say that in terms of the first question regarding imagining something beyond neoliberal capitalism and how we get there. I think that, there's a very important and legitimate concern. I think, though, that we have to attempt to, in fact, do that, because it's quite clear that the economic and social organization that we refer to today as capitalism and capitalism in its neoliberal form is unable, because of the dominance of interests that are more focused on generating profit than attending to the objective needs of global humanity. Has created a situation, my friends, where basically the capital labor contradiction, the traditional sort of contradiction between labor and capital, has now expanded to a contradiction between capital and humanity. That basically, if we aren't able to take power from global capitalism, the capitalist class, and organize a new kind of system that allows us to address the pressing need of climate change, that will help us to have a more rational way in which we allocate the precious resources of Mother Earth. If we don't prevent the escalating nuclear madness that's developing with the U.S. Believing that is developing the capacity to engage in a first strike against either Russia or China, and are rapidly moving weapons into place that might give them that capacity. If we don't organize a new kind of economic system that allows us to be able to live in peace and to address the fact that 80% of humanity is attempting to live off of less than $10 a day, that billions of people are living in abject poverty. We have to remind ourselves that the conditions that people are facing globally with abject poverty, with 30,000 people in the US dying every year unnecessarily because they don't have health care, with that number tripling when you look at the global numbers. where mothers are still dying from the lack of health care, where we have infant mortality rates in the US that are the same as the disastrous and shameful infant mortality rates in the so-called global South. If we're not able to address those conditions and those structural contradictions as a collective humanity, then my friends, we're finished. We're finished. So we at a stage where if we don't begin to build a new society, if we don't imagine something beyond this, if we succumb to the idea that there is no alternative, that basically we are surrendering to organized barbarism, because that's what we are in fact facing today. And with this organized barbarism, and the fact that the capitalists have no material incentive because they're all engaged in short-term objectives, then the fact that the planet may become uninhabitable for human beings is a real possibility. So, you know, the contradictions are such where either we build a new kind of a movement and take power from these criminals, or we succumb to barbarism. I believe that not only is that a historical necessity to in fact do that, I believe we have the global capacity to in fact do that, because we're in the majority. They're in the minority. On the issue of the limitations of spontaneous resistance, and that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a spontaneous resistance, people fed up, frustrated, angry, outraged, and they've gone to the streets. Those spontaneous demonstrations are very important, but we know that the kind of movement that we are talking about, that I'm talking about, can only be sustained when you are building more effective organizations, when we are in fact building movements and structures that will allow us to be able to, in a disciplined and structured way, to advance our forces, to win people over to radical change, to be able to withstand the attempts on the part of the rulers to undermine our attempts to try to build new societies. So what we're going to see in the US, what's happening in other parts of the world, is a movement toward building sustainable organization that concentrates the power of the people so that we can in fact make a real fundamental change. And connected to that is the kind of issues that we have to surface and deal with. We have to engage in what I call a sort of issue discrimination. That is, to identify issues that if we are able to win certain demands, that will facilitate the shift in power from the rulers to the people. So, for example, if the cry to defund the police, if that slogan does not really address the issue of the structural relationship between communities of working class people and the police, then that is not going to go very far in terms of bringing about real change. That is a slogan that in fact can be incorporated by the state, because when you unpack the defund the police, it is almost a call to just cut the budgets of the police departments, make them more efficient, transfer responsibilities to other parts of the state, without addressing the relationship between the state and the people. We say that it has to be community control of the police. That is a democratic demand, that if Juan really begins to shift power to the police, I mean, to the people. So we have to have issues that help us to, in fact, do that, to shift power to the people. And so that kind of issue discrimination has to be part of the arsenal of tools that we develop as we build these movements, both in our national environments, but also globally. That's why we say, you know, in the U.S., we have to raise the issue of U.S. foreign bases. That's why we organize and try to develop this campaign to not only deal with U.S. foreign bases, but to deal with U.S. and NATO foreign bases, because NATO and these foreign bases are the forward deployment of concentrated colonial capitalist power. It is imperialism in its most graphic and naked sense. And so, you know, raising a demand like that and winning some movement on that helps to shift power to the people and to undermine the ability of empire to be able to project itself. So this is the kind of these are the kind of issues that we have to raise as we are building our independent political power among the people.
Thanks very much, Ajamu. So there's a couple of people there. First of all, I'll just ask Kieran McCausland to come in. He has his hand up, and then there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll read out afterwards. Kieran?
Thank you, Eilish. I was just wondering, Ajamu, do you is there, apart from the protest work and stuff that we as a political party do in Ireland, is there anything other in a practical sense that we can do to highlight the issue you talked about regarding the political prisoners in the United States, where some are been languishing in prison for up to 50 years? Is there any sort of online support network or anything supporting these people who are spending a lifetime in prison? Thank you.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to add a couple more to that, Ajamu, if you don't mind. So 2 questions from Porrig Mannion. Firstly, has the unity of the peace movements that seem to be demonstrated at the Dublin conference, has that grown and developed, or has there been a slight trend backwards? And the second question from Porrig, what organizational tools and strategies are you using to develop organization in the United States? I don't know if Porrig is talking to a specific organization or just generally. And then just the final one for this round, maybe, and I know there's a few others want to come in as well. The Black Lives Matters from Cullum, the Black Lives Matters protests quite clearly indicated demand for change, but this would not fit comfortably with the potential Joe Biden presidency. The question is, does the movement help a Biden presidency, or does Ajamu believe these voters will break to a third party or stay home on election day? I think all of us, again, are thankful for our proportional representation electoral system at times like this. Okay, so if you want to maybe take those together, and then there's one person asking for Michael Clark's book, so I'll put that into the chat now. There's one other question from Cian. If anybody else wants to come in, maybe stick your questions in the chat box, and we'll take one final round after this. Okay, Ajamu, over to you.
Thank you. I think for the question on political prisoners, I think raising that issue, making the public there in Ireland aware of it, would be incredibly important. I will send back some links. I don't have them at my fingertips, of 2 organizations that are taking the lead in educating the public on the existence of political prisoners and providing support to those prisoners. So I will make sure that I send that back and that could be circulated. People need to know this. You know, when the U.S. stands up and talks about it being a defender of human rights, we want people to remind the authorities of these contradictions. Okay, so raising that is very, very important. Once you get information on those prisoners, maybe doing teach-ins or incorporating that information into your public work would be important. Connecting the issue of political prisoners to the obscene reality of the U.S. being the state that has the largest percentage of its population incarcerated than any other state on this planet, and that half of the 2 million people who are currently in the dungeons of the U.S. prison system are Black and brown people. So these kinds of issues need to be raised, because we are also involved in the ideological struggle. You know, we want people to understand that, you know, what is being projected as the apex of capitalist civilization is a mirage, and that if this is the best that we can do, then we're in serious question, serious trouble. So we want people to be able to imagine a situation beyond this. We're still striving in the U.S. to build unity among the anti-war, pro-peace, and anti-imperialist organizations and movements. We are beginning to see that the moral position of being anti-war and pro-peace, while important, some people are beginning to see that if that's not connected to a firm, clear stance against imperialism, then it fails to generate the kind of power that it needs to generate, and clarity that needs to be generated today. We can have any misunderstandings, any illusions around what is in play with U.S. Policy, what is in play with of NATO policies, as NATO is expanding its relationships and activities way beyond the North Atlantic area, being used as tools in Africa and in Latin America. So, you know, we want people to understand the nature of these systems, and that we've got to take resolute positions against them, and understand that the warmongering, the destabilization, the sanctions are all tools to advance an imperialist agenda. There's a material incentive to warmongering. And so that connection between our moral opposition and an explanation for why that is happening in terms of the material incentives and material interests, that connection has to be made, and we think that in fact is happening. What are some of the tools and strategies for how we build and how we develop more effective organizations? Well, in the U.S., and I mean, I can't really speak to the realities of Ireland. In every situation, as we all know, is very complex and very particular. So I would never try to, advise what should be done in your context. We do know, though, that to the extent that you build effective organization that is moving politics to a place where we can begin to link up all of the forces that are anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, the better for the world. And when we are able to put a check on the growing neo-fascist activity in the northern countries, in Western Europe, again, the better it is for all of us. In the US, though, we say we have to build dual power. That is, we want to build and are building independent political organizations that are addressing the needs of the people, providing material support to the people. And for example, the issue of community control is one of the elements of that process of building independent political power. We say dual power because we also will engage the state. We are using now the electoral arena to, in fact, do that. While many of us used to take a hands-off stance on electoralism, we now see that there are some real possibilities in the electoral arena, in particular on the local level, where you have state positions that are there that can be taken as part of a broader strategy for building local power. So we say we build independent power, but we also engage the state also. So dual and contending power, because we realize and we recognize that we cannot avoid the issue of the state, and we cannot avoid the reality that unless we're able to shift power from the state, in fact, build a new kind of state and system, then we're not going to be able to address the objective needs of our people and the working class and humanity in general. Which leads into the question on the Black Lives Matter phenomenon and Joe Biden and the Democrats. You know, one of the ways in which the state, we believe, has been moving to try to, in some ways, almost depoliticize the resistance, is to, in fact, keep this at a level of something called racial justice, as I said before. You know, we see this interesting phenomenon where everybody from the from the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S., the top military person, to Republican senators like Mitt Romney and even Lindsey Graham and police chiefs, everybody can say that they are for reform and that Black lives matter. And corporations are saying that. They are funneling now millions of dollars to these various formations. But we say that that is, not only is it easy, but it is an indication of what is really in play politically. That as long as you talk about Black Lives Matter and in a sort of abstract way, then you're hoping that no one's going to remember that the same people who are talking about Black lives mattering in the US are the same ones that didn't utter a peep when the Israelis were slaughtering Palestinians on the Gaza border. They're the same ones that didn't oppose the Obama administration's attack on Libya. They're the same ones that gave a green light to the US-Saudi war on Yemen. They're the same ones that tried to prevent the Trump administration from too aggressively pulling troops out of Afghanistan and try to tie his hands from withdrawing US occupation forces in South Korea. So, you know, these are the same people who, you know, will talk about the sanctity of life in the US and pretend that they care about Black lives. But, you know, when we tell them, well, you know, there's Black people in Venezuela who are a fundamental base of this support for the Bolivarian process, and they are disproportionately dying as a consequence of U.S. sanctions, then there's confusion and silence. So we're not impressed with these declarations of Black Lives Matter and all of that, and we're not impressed with how this movement is getting pimped by the state. We know that people in other parts of the world who are experiencing racial discrimination, racial oppression, they just call for Black Lives Matter is an important one, and people are taking that up in places like France, in Israel, and other places. That's very important. But we say that, you know, that pivot has to take place where we look at the nature of the systems of oppression, and we say that until we are moving toward developing effective multinational, multiracial, working class based movements to take power, to sweep this capitalist imperialist system off the face of the planet, then we're never going, if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to address the issues that are driving people into the streets. We're never going to deal with the issue of racial oppression. We're never going to deal with the reality of all of the forms of oppression and exploitation that characterizes contemporary life in the U.S. And around the world. So, you know, we say Joe Biden and the Democrats who are attempting to colonize this movement, who are perpetuating the myth that they represent a real alternative to the Trump administration and the interests that they represent. We say, from the point of view of Black people and the Black working class in the U.S., we say that the day after the election in November, it doesn't really matter who is sitting in the white people's house in Washington, D.C. Nothing would be different for us. We'll still be on the bottom of the economic ladder. We'll still have these racist police killing our folks. We'll still have the U.S. Africa Command in Africa extending its military footprint. So we're clear about who the enemy is. It's not about Trump, who barely controls the executive branch of government, but it's about the neoliberal forces that are the ones that really control the state. It is the state and the system that is the enemy. And so we're not confused by that.
Thanks very much, Ajamu. Okay, so there's one question there from Ian, which I'm going to read out now. If anybody else does want to come in, just put up your hand, or perhaps put a question in the chat box. Otherwise, I think we'll probably leave it at that. So Kian says, my question is, how is socialism going to stop racism? Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism, but I can't see how socialism is going to change racism. So what is socialism going to change that would put a stop to racism? And then Allah, apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, said, can you explain the significance of the Seattle Autonomous Zone? So Gavin, do you want to come in there? I can see you've unmuted yourself. And Declan.
There you go.
Okay, Declan, did you want to come in?
Sorry, just one thing I'd like to ask is, a lot of Black people in America have been disenfranchised because they went to jail or have a criminal record. If those people were given the vote, would it make a difference in any election in the States in the future? We're talking about millions of people here. Once you get a criminal record in the States, you will not let a vote again in that country.
Yeah.
It's a very important vote, and I mean, we have gerrymandered in this country for years and years, and it was an effective tool of oppression.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, in terms of Seattle, Seattle's a very, very interesting situation. as we all are watching this unfold, and we have some people there in Seattle, where the people have basically cleared a zone out, and they're exercising autonomy. They are saying that this is a place where the people can in fact rule, and they are in fact doing that. Now, it's interesting on so many different levels. Of course, we know that the Trump administration sees this as a very dangerous um, um, situation, and not because they only have 6 blocks, that's nothing, but I think they're concerned, and rightly so, about the model, the example that might inspire. Because when you talk about defunding or dismantling the police, you in that you are implying the capacity to basically govern yourselves. And so if you believe that, then why do you need to wait for a decision to be made by the state when you can begin a process of taking hold of your communities, exercising community self-determination, governing yourself. And so if that begins to take hold, then that is another wrinkle in the unfolding and deepening contradictions in the U.S. in terms of its legitimation crisis. Part of what we have seen with this uprising and with COVID-19 is a deepening of the legitimation crisis in the U.S. People have lost complete faith in public authorities. There's no real respect for public authorities. And we saw that at the height of the COVID-19, when the Trump administration failed to provide national leadership, national coordination, we started seeing states that were forced to operate on their own, beginning to form sort of regional coalitions. We saw this happen up in New York with a number of states coming together and coordinating among themselves. We know that a state like California, for example, has the seventh largest economy on the planet. You saw the various states that are in line with the Trump administration completely refusing to abide by the guidance from the CDC. So, I saw the beginnings of the U.S., which is an artificial state because it's a settler colonial state, beginning to come apart, okay, because of this lack of legitimacy. And so we are seeing that this autonomous zone is part of a process of people recognizing that not only, one, that they have power, but secondly, that they don't have to be bound by the local municipal power, municipal state power, and that that recognition, I think, is a good thing. But from the point of view of the authorities, from the state, it is a very, very dangerous one. And that's why the Trump administration wants to see that experiment in people's democracy, people's control, to be, in fact, clamped down. In terms of the issue of voting and who people might vote for, yeah, they have a system that's very effective in disenfranchising millions of people. Some states are moving to correct that, but they have a very, very sophisticated system where if you get convicted with certain felonies, you're unable to vote. You can maybe, depending on the state, you can petition the state and be allowed to vote again. But the result of disenfranchising people who have been incarcerated, who have criminal records, is that you are taking millions of people off the voting rolls. And who might they vote for? Well, it remains to be seen, but many of the people who are going to jail and prison in the US are working class folks, people of color. That population, when they do vote, they would tend to vote for the Democrats because, of course, the Democrats have the mythology that they are supposed to be protecting the interests of the workers. And we say mythology because in particular in the last 40 years, is a complete lie. They are right in the bed with the neoliberal finance capitalists and corporations. So yeah, if they were allowed to vote, they would probably vote Democrat or vote independent. And there are more people who are thinking along independent lines that people might be made aware of. And we saw that even in 2016, that even though when it came to election day, people, because they had been scared out of their wits about the possibility of Trump, many people who were expressing support for our campaign, Jill Stein and myself, and we felt the momentum not dissipate during the campaign in those last few weeks in the U.S. We saw situations like I ended up in Detroit 8 days out from the election on the same day that Tim Kaine, who was Hillary Clinton's vice presidential running mate, we ended up in the same city on the same day, 8 days from the election. And guess who was drawing larger crowds? So there was something in the air. People were coming out listening to our message. And you see the potential of our message because what was the centerpiece of our campaign? The Green New Deal. And that's the Green New Deal that AOC lifted from us. They lifted the language elements of it, but we had the original Green New Deal as a transitional program. And we saw that people were responding to that. So yeah, so people will vote Democrat, but people are now leaning more and more toward independent stance, independent vote also. So that is also seen as a danger to both parties. Because people might recall that the attacks that we suffered in 2016 didn't come from Republicans, it came from the Democrats. So yes, disenfranchisement is something that has to be dealt with, you know, and it's being dealt with, I think, slowly but surely. Now, there's another question. I can't even recognize my own handwriting.
Let me see. So you covered the question in relation to, oh yeah, I think it was probably Keane's, how is socialism going to stop racism?
Oh yes, yeah. Right.
So we probably finish up on that one, which is maybe a good note to finish on, hopefully, as well. So give it your best.
Okay. We're going to solve the problems of the world right now. You know, that's a very interesting question, and I will answer that in this way. You see, for some of us, we don't define ourselves as so-called anti-racist, meaning that I'm not that concerned about what's in somebody's mind. What we're concerned about is the power that some have to be able to determine our lives. So we see the struggle of Black people in the US, the Black working class, as a struggle for power. We see ourselves not only as workers, but we are colonized people, a colonial situation of a special type, but we are a colonized people also. So we are struggling for power, and therefore we recognize and identify what we see as the structures of white power. And those structures of white power are connected to the colonial capitalist system itself. So we identify NATO, for example, as a structure of white power. The International Monetary Fund the World Bank, the hegemony of the dollar is a relationship of white power. You know, the U.S. state. So for us is a question of power. Now, if we are able to bring about a situation in which we are able to win power and begin the process of building socialism, and we take away the power of the capitalist ruling class, then we are in a position then where detrimental policies based on race would not be in place. We still have to deal with some of the attitudes that some people might have, but that is a process of transformation. That's part of the process of transforming ourselves and our society. If we get to a point where we're able to win power and we're on the road to socialism, you can almost assume that we have a new kind of person that's already well down the road of identifying and conquering issues of white supremacist ideology. So for us, you know, the only way that we in fact are able to transform ourselves and to build new societies is when we are well on the way toward building new socialist societies. And we could discuss and talk about the different ways in which we get there, but we really believe that this issue of white supremacy or white racism is something that is not permanent. It can't be defeated, and it will be defeated. It was something that was created by human beings, and therefore it can be conquered, defeated by human beings. We just have to believe in that and believe in the possibility of a new world, building unity among ourselves based on our common political positions, and we'll be all right.
Brilliant. Thanks a million, Ajamu. Really appreciate it. And it's always good to end on a positive note. So, look, thanks a million. Do stay in touch with us, maybe through Michael and Pana, about anything we can do here in terms of support. For anybody who hasn't come to one of these talks before, we'll have another one next Thursday. Fergus Whelan will be speaking about 1798, William Drennan and the United Irishmen. And we've run a series of these talks, many of them on topics like anti-imperialism. And I'm just putting a link to our YouTube channel there where all of our most recent talks are uploaded. So you can have a look there if you're interested, the Workers' Party of Ireland. So do log on to our Facebook page. You'll be able to see any upcoming talks there. And Ajamu, we look forward to seeing you in Ireland at some point in the near future again, hopefully. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you for hosting this.